Back with you tonight on In Focus. Medical professionals have expressed concern for patients with chronic conditions and those with cancer as the country begins to run out of essential medicine. Reports suggest that pharmacists are scrambling to find key ingredients and supplies of morphine powder and painkillers. Joining us now for more on that and an update on the situation at both private and state facilities is Jackie Maiman, CEO of the Independent Community Pharmacy Association. Jackie, good evening. Good to have you with us tonight here on In Focus. You're linking this shortage to the effects or the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Give us context. How do the two link?
So, Thabo, yes, good evening and good evening to all the viewers. So, at the beginning of the pandemic, when we had the lockdowns, I think every country that experienced any form of lockdown had a slowdown in manufacturing. That slowdown had a sort of almost an effect where it just caused shortages. And, you know, we've coming out of the pandemic now, but 80% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients are actually sourced from China and India. And of course, as we know, China is seeing a resurgence at the moment, which could again put a bit of pressure onto the supply chain. So this is not unexpected, but I think it is being well managed. We haven't completely run out of anything, and there aren't patients that are going without medicines, but we are with certain ingredients having to change medication or try and find alternatives.
Yeah, we'll come to the alternatives question in a moment. But how is it possible that some chains would see no shortages while others would see shortages? What's the difference between, for example, Aspen and Clicks, who are saying, no, we've seen no shortages where we are sitting, and your members who are seeing shortages?
So I think, well, Aspen is a manufacturer, so it's a large manufacturer in South Africa. So, you know, possibly they are not seeing any shortages in their particular product range. I know I did read the report where Clicks said they're not seeing any shortages. Well, there are shortages, but I think maybe what they are inferring is that nobody's going without medicine, which I agree. We do find alternatives.
Is this by design, or is it situational that we would, as they say, have our eggs in one basket and having only to get those key ingredients, those active ingredients, 90% of them coming from China and India?
So, yeah, I think it's just the way it is that the vast majority of APIs, we call them APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, come from a country as large as China. And it is a bit of a concern. I think as a developing nation, we need to get our medicines from a source that for us is reliable and is cost effective. Very often sourcing raw materials from, for instance, Europe or the Americas can be quite expensive. Saying that, I think it is really is time that South Africa looks into starting to really manufacture more of our own medicines on the continent. And I think we would be the first. And I really think it's overdue that Africa starts to embrace this, because we've got such rich resources here.
Yeah. One of the academics in Cape Town is saying that the reasons for the shortages is the over-consolidation of the active ingredients market. What needs to happen to unlock that over-concentration?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's the golden question. So I don't know. As I say, there is this reliance on very few countries that we source it from, and as I say, you know, I think going forward, which could take many years, is to start manufacturing our own active pharmaceuticals here in South Africa. Obviously, we could try and broaden where we purchase raw materials from, but it very often comes down to supply and demand. And I am quite sure that South Africa is not the only country that is experiencing shortages.
Yeah, I believe it is a global problem as well, which makes it a little bit more serious and maybe even more difficult to address. But coming back home, the other issue is the reporting system of when you are out of stock. That apparently is not well kept, in fact, not well policed even. There are no legal requirements to report when stock is out in South Africa.
Yes, I agree. Very often the first time we become aware of it is when we find it difficult to source stock. And that's when I heard you saying that, we're sort of scrambling and borrowing from each other. So, I think a pharmacist's primary duty is to try and get medicine to our patients that need it. So we do often phone other pharmacies, borrow stock. So that will be the first thing. And then we get hold of our wholesalers. We find out from the wholesalers that the manufacturer is out of stock. Then generally a letter will come from the manufacturer stating that a certain medication is out of stock and a predicted date that it'll be back in stock. So it's at that point where we would try and source another trade name, another generic medicine. If all the generics, so in other words, all the brands of a particular molecule are out of stock, then we have to get hold of the prescribing doctor and get what we call a therapeutic substitute. So that's where you actually change class of medicine just to treat the condition in the stopgap while we try and source those medicines.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. The reporting system, I think in the public sector, probably with their large depots, they have got a better handle on it than we do in the private sector. We tend to be quite fragmented. There are many, many manufacturers, whereas in the state sector, it will go out on tender. So there'll be a single supplier or maybe one or two suppliers, and they will be held accountable. If they say they can deliver 300,000 units of medicines a month, then they must do that. That is their contract. Whereas in the private sector, we don't have that. We source medicines from many manufacturers through many wholesalers and distributors.
Let's talk then the alternative. Is alternative medication, is that always the best solution? I mean, for example, if you're talking cancer patients and even those on medical aid will tell you alternatives might even at some point prove to be costly than their regular medication that they're taking.
Okay, so yes, so as a pharmacist, the law says that we must always offer a cheaper alternative, a more cost-effective alternative known as a generic substitute if there is one available. So if your doctor scripts a brand name, a well-known brand name, and there is a less expensive generic medicine available, we need to offer that to you. However, there is a caveat to that. We could say to you, if it is a medicine with something we call a narrow therapeutic index, in other words, the slightest change in blood levels can have an adverse effect on you, we may actually say to you, we don't recommend that you change this. So that, as I say, is a generic. There are many medicines where you can change generics and it'll have no effect on your condition. But medications such as anticonvulsants for epileptics, certain cardiac medicines, we are wary to just change those without notifying the prescribing doctor. So those changes are still okay. When we have to do a therapeutic change, so we may be taking you from a certain class of medicine, say it is what we call an ACE inhibitor, we might be able to find another ACE inhibitor within that class. If we can't and we have to change classes, then that is not ideal. It means basically we're almost at the start, when you were first diagnosed, and we have to titrate a dose for you to get the same effect. And it can take 2 or 3 months for you to settle down again. So it is not ideal. But I think the main thing that I want to say is people mustn't panic. There are alternatives, and we will make sure that the conditions are controlled. You did mention, however, the possibly cancer patients, long-term patients on palliative care. That's the morphine powder, and we are concerned at the moment. There appears to be shortages of morphine powder, and there aren't really any other alternatives that are cost-effective. I checked with the manufacturers. The morphine ampules, which means it would be injectable form, are also out of stock. So that would mean you could go to morphine tablets, or you could go to something like fentanyl patches. The problem with the patches, while the release of medicine is wonderful, the patches stay on and it lasts for 3 days, they are quite expensive. And so that may be a barrier for some people. Also, you must remember that the medical schemes have got formularies. And so you've then got to get hold of the scheme, you've got to change the chronic authorization, you've got to justify the change. So it can be quite a rigmarole. So we're watching that carefully. I do believe that morphine powder is on order, and hopefully it will arrive in time and we won't completely exhaust the stocks that we have got.
Yeah. We spoke just now about the state capacity, for example, to have a much more tighter register of what comes in and what goes out. But, by the way, we did reach out to the Department of Health to be a part of the conversation. But there are others who are raising concerns around the private sector having more options, alternative options, as you put them, than state patients. How true is that?
So, yes, I mean, you're quite correct. So the state will, as I say, order medicines on a tender. So they may have 1 or 2 suppliers for a particular type of medicine, and those are done under contract. They check that the manufacturer can actually manufacture the quantities that are required. So failing the actual active ingredient running out, they should be able to supply it. But they do have less of a choice than in the private sector. The state facilities, they run on quite tight formularies, which are based on scientific or evidence-based essential medicines list. So if, for instance, you are a hypertension sufferer, you may have the choice of 1 or 2 ACE inhibitors, maybe 1 beta blocker, whereas in the private sector, we may have 7 or 8 ACE inhibitors and 10, 12 different beta blockers. I don't think it necessarily means that the medicine choices are better in the private sector. There just are more choices. I think where possibly in the private sector we may have more is on the more expensive medicines. So, but there again is a challenge because the medical schemes won't always pay for expensive medicines when there is a less expensive alternative that evidence shows works. So it is one thing to have choice, but that choice does come with a cost.
Yeah. And Jackie, as far as the injectable contraceptives, is there a turnaround on that shortage? What's the cause, and how are you working around that?
All right. So the injectable contraceptives, the information I have from the public sector is they are now managing to source it via a special, what they call a Section 21 license. In the private sector, we are still seeing some shortages, especially of what we call the 2-month or the Neristorate injection. But I believe the Depo-Provera, there is some stock. At one stage, probably about a year ago, we were actually out of stock of both of them. And we weren't even able to procure stock from the public sector. So we had a lot of people that were on the injectable contraceptives that we had to switch either to oral contraceptives or to the implant, IUDs, or to condoms. But there were always alternatives. But yeah, it's inconvenient. And once somebody is stabilized on something, it's not nice to change them. So I think as pharmacists and as any healthcare professionals, it's not pleasant when medicines are short, and it certainly isn't pleasant for the people that are taking it. But we don't leave anybody without medicines.
Are these shortages likely going to result in price adjustments, maybe going forward? And when are we likely to see those adjustments beginning to come in?
All right. So medicine prices are highly regulated in this country. They are governed by the pricing committee, which falls under the National Department of Health. So if you are a manufacturer in South Africa, you get a chance to increase your prices annually. When we have an annual increase, it's usually earlier in the year. And what the government does is it'll look at things like the CPI, it'll have a look at the rand dollar exchange rate, and they will factor in a percentage. Generally, the percentage is usually about 3.9%. It's been in that sort of realm for a few years. If, for instance, a manufacturer is sourcing medicines, because most of our medicines are imported, and the price has really gone up, they can apply to the government to have an increase, but manufacturers cannot just willy-nilly increase prices. The negative side of this, obviously, is if a manufacturer finds it's no longer viable to have a medicine in South Africa, we may lose that medicine. So I think, the government always needs to look at all the evidence before they make decisions. And as I say, that's called the single exit price, and it is governed. Once that price is set, they can drop the price, but they can't increase it without permission. So I don't think we need to worry too much about that.
Right, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on, Jackie Maiman, CEO of the Independent Community Pharmacy Association. They're raising some red flags on some of the issues, but looks like some of them, the industry beginning to have a handle on them, but hoping that at least matters will stabilize in the next 3 months or so.